technically speaking, they wouldn't have been invited. This was more a way for us to include some of the peace activists in the actual conference, just to give some alternate points of view that there are other voices at work here, sort of a public voice, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. They represent, I think Bertrand Russell told me once, the best one dimension of civil society. So, they're representing the people, so to speak.
And they were part of the discussion at the time. Okay, treated, as you might have got the impression here, with a certain disdain by the statesmen. But certainly the statesmen of France and Britain could not ignore their public opinion. Of course, there was a segment of public opinion as well. There was a quite different voice from that of the Bertrand Russells and the Jean Jaurès.
And Jean Jaurès sat in the National Assembly of France and was the leader of the largest socialist party. So, I mean, these voices, although they wouldn't have been invited at this table, were certainly being heard at this time. And things obviously would have radically changed, in the ensuing sort of weeks after this. But at this time, they would have been relevant voices.
And Bertrand Russell wasn't as active politically as he would become after war broke out. But he was a representative of the sort of left wing of the Liberal Party, of which Edward Grey was a cabinet minister. And throughout his tenure in office, he'd always had one eye to those radical critics. They were never influential or powerful enough to make him change his policy, but you could say that they were influential and powerful enough to make him be somewhat coy about it, and to not sort of declare his full hand, although he had other reasons for acting in that way as well.
And that, just as a sort of interesting aside, Jean Jaurès is actually assassinated 2 days after the end of this, on July the 31st, 1914, as a result of his views by a French nationalist. So.
Bertrand Russell lived to the ripe old age.
So some of, in the diplomacy leading up to this, the people who were playing certainly were. Part of the reason, like you have the, a number of the Anglo-Russian conventions focus on Persia, for example, as well as also curbing the Great Game. So there's always, there's the role of colonial forces in terms of just colonialism and competing colonialisms and empires certainly comes to play in their diplomacies. In this, I think many of us, I don't want to speak for all of us, but I think we're more focusing on a European, at least. Let's see if we can start with, would this be a Balkan war, and then going beyond that.
The question of the collapsing Ottoman Empire, the resolution of the Eastern question was, and we alluded to it briefly in the course of the discussion, probably the closest matter to the European high politics of the time. So both Britain and Germany had military missions in the Ottoman Empire, supporting their attempts at military reform. And that caused particularly the dispatch of the German mission to Constantinople in December 1913, caused quite a stir and raised considerable objections from the Russians, whose interests in the Straits have been long-standing and opposed to those of Germany.
It's interesting, Gray himself, although he might be called a liberal imperialist, he's part of this group of liberal imperialists. He himself, his foreign policy was very Eurocentric.
Frankly, his motivation for coming is a little bit of an artifice, and his immediate response to Gray's invitation was, first of all, to reject it out of hand. As far as Germany was concerned, the Germans were also asked to convey the invitation to the Austrians and to encourage the Austrians to participate. They did so, and then they sent another message by another means, encouraging the Austrians to also reject Gray's proposal.
Yes, but in this imaginary timeline, there must be a motivation for him to come. So what is the motivation that underpins your being there? Why are you there?
Well,
you personify.
Yeah.
Counter-historical.
Yes, you're getting at the sort of the artifice of this enactment, but in this case, we're well. I would say I'm probably here to attempt to get Russia to back down from their support of Serbia, their perceived support of Serbia. There was some concern that Russia would act on behalf of Serbia, and the Kaiser was quite concerned with the fact that he viewed the assassination of Franz Ferdinand as a regicide, as an attack on the institution of monarchy. And so the German policy was in part dictated by a desire to see that particular offense responded to. That's, of course, not the only consideration. The Kaiser himself actually thought that Serbia's response was sufficient to prevent a war, and the Kaiser's more moderate position was not conveyed to Vienna by the Chancellor. So there's some internal politics going on, and Bethmann Hollweg seems to have been more in the war camp, but certainly would have wanted some sort of firm response towards Serbia, even if that was a negotiated response.
Well, I could start with Russia, since they're the one where Sazonov quite simply lied. They were undergoing what was, basically a period of preparatory war, pre-mobilization, wonderful sort of nice words that really actually don't disguise anything. The fact of the matter is that when this would have started, they would have had some intelligence, all the other parties here, and in fact there's some wonderful documents that actually, for example, show diplomats in, say, Warsaw going, "It looks like we're getting ready for war. What's going on? No war's been declared." And so what you end up having is this period where Sazonov is actually one of the major proponents of this, along with Yanushkevich, and eventually all the Council of Ministers heavily start to promote this idea of let's get ready for war, almost as a tactic to hope that Austria-Hungary will stand down. They would have generally known, at least at this meeting, for example, that something was going on. Whether it was mobilization, they would have probably assumed it was, simply, and this is one of those interesting historiographical points, but whether Sazonov, for example, even understood that really pre-mobilization is just mobilization, it's going to be taken that way, and things like that. There would have been, to an extent, probably some knowledge of some of the military plans. They would have certainly known that Russia's, for example, heavily undergoing radical reforms and things like this. With regards to the Russian aspect of it, one of the interesting things that comes out with mobilization, for example, is that once they start this sort of half pre-mobilization, there's actually discussions that go, well, wait a minute, we don't know what that is. We only know full mobilization. That's all they know, really. That's how the plans go. So in many ways, they're improvising. And we could make arguments both ways in which whether that was probably the best thing to do. It was probably not. But at least for the Russian case, there's definitely the sign that something fishy is going on.
In terms of France, it appears everything that is happening is about defense, because they're constantly worried about living in the shadow of Germany, especially coming out of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. And going into these events, I know that Poincaré was advising Joffre not to engage in offensive strategies to go through Belgium to actually go at the Germans. He was saying that that was a bad idea because he wants France to be seen not as aggressive in this, because that way the British will be more likely to align with France if they're not taking the offensive. So they're actually pulling them back from trying to go through Germany.
The British are pretty late coming to everything. They don't know what's going on in Russia, and there's no mobilization, although there is some talks of naval mobilization, but again, it comes very late.
So besides attempting to break each other's diplomatic cables, which just about every power in Europe was doing to greater or lesser degrees of efficiency, by the 26th of July, so the day on which the invitation from Gray was received, Berlin knew that Serbia was fully mobilized, and on that same day Russia mobilized 4 military districts, at which point their circumstances preparatory to war, or phase preparatory to war, started to look to any observers in those cities very much like preparation for war. And so at that point, Germany's going, okay, we may end up having to fight Russia here. It was kind of a foregone conclusion that if Russia attacked Austria-Hungary, Germany would fight as well on that front. And around this time, I wouldn't call it mobilization, but for example, soldiers in Alsace-Lorraine started wearing field grey uniforms instead of the regular garrison uniforms. So there was also this sort of foregone conclusion, at least in the German military, that the war would be on both fronts. And there was this sense of encirclement where they knew they would have, if they fought Russia, they would probably also have to fight France.
From Austria-Hungary's position, I mean, people know that we're just moving really slowly. But Serbians certainly knew, as a byproduct, and the Russians would certainly know, Germany would know. I mean, people know what we're about right now.
And on the 28th, there was no question.
Yeah, well, yeah, definitely.
Well, in terms of Poincaré, like he actually lived in Lorraine, so like he was under the occupation for a while, and he is not very friendly to the Germans. However, in my research in preparing for this, it does seem that the majority of the French people, although bitter about the loss, they don't want a war over it. Like they're not happy that it's gone, but they're not willing to go into a giant war in order to get it back. And it really seems once war is declared and later on that becomes kind of used as like a metaphor for why we went in, like to get it back and revenge. But really the public's mind and even Poincaré's mind at the time really isn't really centered around that.
There's a statement by Ira Crow just before the war breaks out, and he's arguing that it would be worse for Britain, depending on who won, either way, if they stayed out of the war. If they stayed out and France and Russia won, they would be upset with Britain for not helping them. If if Austria and Germany won and they didn't help, again, things would not be good for them because their allies would be down and out.
Well, and following like the Fashoda crisis in particular, the relations between France and Britain they're cooling down, I would say. Like they're not as aggressive as they were. They're trying to figure out what their colonial interests are, and they're not being as aggressive towards each other, and they're making some like discussions and talks of what they're doing.
The big sticking point for Britain was the idea that you could have somebody, a hostile power, in control of the Channel ports. That was the thing that the nightmare scenario. However, you have talk when Britain is not yet fully committed to war. Bethmann Hollweg, I believe, posits the idea: if you stay out, we will respect the territorial integrity of France and Belgium. Now, again, we're in the realm of counterfactual speculation yet again. But the historian Niall Ferguson has posited that this actually probably would have happened had Britain stayed out of the war. Germany wins a quick war. Britain's actually, in terms of the balance of power, the thing that supposedly motivates Grey, no worse off at the end of that than than if they'd gone in. And in fact, not suffering the after effects of 4 years of exhaustion militarily, politically, economically.
But 1870, what foreign power that could be possible was in control of France.
There's a more recent precedent for British mediation in the Balkans specifically, which is at the end of the First Balkan War. And a conference did actually convene in London. Interestingly, it was a great power conference with very few of the actual parties from the Balkan War participating, much like this conference here, where Serbia is not invited. That conference, again, much like ours, ended up being overtaken by events on the ground as the Second Balkan War basically rendered any agreement that was reached at the 1913 London conference irrelevant. So there was a precedent in Britain having an interest in this particular region, and the belligerents involved in that war, the Balkan Wars, we're talking about Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, the Ottoman Empire, Britain is in the 19th century intervened in the 1850s to preserve Ottoman control of the Straits. So there is a precedent, particularly in this region, for Britain playing a role in both in mediation and in military intervention.
And just one other quick point is there were certainly a number of voices within Britain that were certainly concerned about the impact on the British Empire. Especially once the war begins, this is a major focus of, because obviously now one of the big changes between 1870 and 1914 is that Germany now has an empire. There is now a much greater sort of imperial concerns still have some weight, and certainly Grey potentially would have been very concerned about a number of them, and add that also that just that with the Germans, for example, adding to their naval capacity, that would have been considered a potential threat as well. So there's a number of different reasons that could be levied to gain support for British intervention in some way, shape, or form.
And actually, he didn't have much support. Grey was privately anti-German and was much more pro-intervention, but most of the British public, up until the time war was declared, was closer to Russell's position. They didn't want to get involved at all.
Yeah, and the key is Belgium, which is the great salve to the liberal conscience. I mean, but Russell, right on the brink of war, is trying to mobilise some proper neutrality organisation, fellow Cambridge academics to sign petitions. And the day as soon as war's declared, everybody, the 60 fellows in the Royal Society who signed this Cambridge petition, all go over to the other side. And several of them are later instrumental in drumming him out of the university. So the Belgium is the key, and Grey was aware of that. So that's why he had to keep his cards close to his chest for so long. Didn't have his cabinet on side. Certainly didn't have the bulk of the parliamentary party on side, nor the British people. But the ground was prepared in the sense that you'd had a decade or more of a sort of toxic militaristic mix that manifested itself in various ways, competing with the kind of ideology of peace, retrenchment and reform for which Russell and his friends and allies, critics of Grey inside his own party, stood for.
Well, first with the Russian angle. By this point, by 1914, they are rather close allies for the most part. The reason for this is a number of reasons. There's always a degree of pan-Slavism that's always in the background of Russian diplomacy. Now, what's interesting is that Sazonov and his predecessor, Zvolsky, had both been criticized within the Russian Council of Ministers and other circles about not being pan-Slavic enough. What's interesting, though, with that being also said, is that Sazonov is made promises to Serbian diplomats, suggesting that, for example, South Slav territory would go to them, things like this, and helping them in their ambitions for territory gain. So at this point, and like even throughout the entire crisis, Sazonov and the Russians are heavily involved in trying to get the Serbians to agree to an extent, but at the same time, it's weird because they, for example, tell them agree to the ultimatum, agree to this. They come up with a plan. If there is a military invasion, that would actually call for them to draw back into the interior and allow the Russian Empire, their military, to come in and sort of take the main brunt of the fighting and things like this. But what also ends up happening is the Russians make clear, we're going to come to your aid if something happens and this blows up. You're going to end up having the Serbians, for example, far more willing to risk war because now they've got their big brother standing there and ready to go to war for them, essentially. So you have this sort of growing relationship that develops, especially in the last year or so.
Just to add to what you said, Croatia was actually part of Hungary since medieval times, and when Austria occupies Bosnia in 1878 and annexes it in 1908, the problem for Austria is the Serbian population was still 60% of the population in Bosnia at the time. So the annexation of Bosnia complicates the Serbian element much more so than the Croatian element.
And really, at this time, from an Austro-Hungarian perspective, really any consideration is secondary to not being able to suffer what would be seen as yet another embarrassment in the Balkans. This is sort of like this existential threat. They didn't really think that, from a foreign relations perspective, that they would have, they would be able to maintain their great power status, or that anybody would really take them at all seriously. And internally, it would have been a crushing blow to the monarchy to emerge yet again, to allow such an event to go, basically unrevenged, for lack of a better term. It's more internal there. So there is like the prestige and reputation aspect that they had to come out. The theory behind my character coming to this particular conference, they would not be able to leave this conference without making substantial gains, either with by getting Russia to persuade Serbia to accept Article 5, or to get some equally unpalatable demands met. Just can't walk out of here weak. It's impossible.
Yeah. And, appearing strong and maintaining, not suffering embarrassments was a real interest for many of the monarchies in Europe. Maintaining prestige was not this sort of fluffy thing that you have on the side beside economic interests. It was, especially for the monarchies, very much considered a real interest, very closely tied to the legitimacy of the state. So that informed sort of all, especially the three effectively absolute monarchies, definitely informed their positions.
The Russo-Japanese War would have been a sore point for.
Oh, certainly, and they typically didn't like getting that destroyed, and neither did the people, as they led to some revolution or something happening in 1905, and essentially a significant change in their government in many ways. And well, depending on the year and the date and who was sort of in charge that day and where Nicholas II was thinking, but this was also seen, especially as a way as we cannot let the Serbians just get steamrolled. We have to do something to potentially go in there, and that was a legitimate point of view that a number of very influential ministers in Russia did. In fact, actually, when the ultimatum was delivered, Sazonov berated the Austro-Hungarian diplomat and suggested that, you're going to start a whole general European war. So he knew this was going to descend. And at that point, he in many ways thought it was inevitable before trying to do anything he could to pull back. And that's what, for example, one of the things that he actually points out is if the Serbians are willing to accept mediation by the British, do it. And this is a note that he sends to the Serbs, trying to get them to say, okay, you know what, we might be able to pull back here, at the same time, while also probably doing more to continue war than any other potential Russian minister. So.
They abstained in 1914 because they're in territorial conflict with Austria-Hungary over the South Tyrol. So in 1914, they decide to be neutral, which is a benefit to the Allies, who in 1915 actually get them on the Allied side rather than the other side of the Adriatic in compensation. So the reason Italy's not here is because it wouldn't have really wanted to partake and have to go fight alongside Austria-Hungary when it's in fact trying to get territory away from it.
Although Italy was invited in Gray's proposal, they would have been here as well if they agreed to go.
Yeah. Well, I think the safest way to say is, even if, say, they had to continue mobilization, there's nothing to say that they would have won. Declarations of war would not have been passed, and at that time, declarations of war are still. Every party actually has an official declaration of war, if I'm not mistaken, for the First World War. So I think even at mobilization, it would have cost a lot of money, and it certainly would have been headaches for everyone. But to say that would have immediately just led to war, well, they're already going, I think is problematic, especially given the fact that still, a lot of the countries were pre-mobilizing, to still use that term, or actually mobilizing before actual declarations of war. It was more, look, we know this is probably going to happen, so let's get ready for it. The only advantage it might have towards precipitating war, I would think, is that it would essentially harden the pro-war sides in many cases by saying, look, they're already going. The other sides are still going. We need to do this. we can't look weak here. And so that potentially would have been the one major change there.
Well, and in the Austro-Hungarian case, the military leaders were ready to go to war a year earlier, or just shy of November of 1913. They were ready to go. Plans were ready. So whether it was disappointment or embarrassment of the fact that they didn't, the first word go, mobilization, it's hard to conceive of a way for these guys to say, yeah. I mean, whether it's we didn't get that communication. Once the Austro-Hungarian generals got the go, it's hard for me to believe that they would have found a way to rein that in there. They were rolling.
And just sort of another quick hilarious sort of side note, this is for the post-World War I. Brock Millman actually has some work on the Allied intervention. He argues that, for example, I'm actually now disagreeing with what I just sort of said in one sense, but Brock Millman argues that British soldiers, once they sort of, realized, Bolshevik Russia is doing its thing, they took it upon themselves to sort of conduct their own little war against Bolshevik Russia, helping the white forces in some areas. And this led to Britain having this weird situation where they refused to declare war, yet they were clearly at war. And this weird relationship develops where the military people on the ground are often calling the shots in many ways. I don't know if any new scholarship has come out since that was written about 10, 15 years ago, but that's a potential also drawback had they all of a sudden sat there and said, okay, we're pulling back, and all of a sudden the Austro-Hungarian army and the Russian army, the detachments that were, the regiments there, potentially clash. What happens then? Does it force a hand?